Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today is a solo episode, and I want to dive into a topic around what's going to determine how lean you can get and stay. And again, what are some things that we need to take into consideration within that there? So, going to dive into that there. I think it's a super interesting topic that I haven't discussed as much lately. Before I do that, though, I just want to go over my free body recomp workshop that I'm doing, right? So this will be a live workshop that I'm going to be holding. And inside this, I'm going to go over what body recomp is, the four primary approaches to changing body composition, how to determine whether you should focus on fat loss, more fat loss recomp, more muscle gain recomp, or potentially a combination. We'll talk about some training principles, nutrition strategies, really dive into things like sleep and stress and recovery factors that will influence your results. And then we'll also dive into some real world case studies with me working with clients and how you could potentially utilize their situation for you. So again, if you want to do this, the link to this will be in the show notes. This will be done on Thursday, July 9th at 1 p.m. Central Time there. So obviously you'll have to check depending on where you're coming from, it should be the evening for people over in Europe and over there. And then obviously in the middle of the day for people in the United States. And so again, if you want to sign up, the link to that is in the show notes. You can also reach out to me on Instagram, Jeff, HOEHN_, where I will dive into that, or I'll answer any questions you have on it specifically, and if it would be a good fit for you to attend that. So with that out of the way, let's dive into today's topic. So what I want to talk about is what determines how lean you can get and stay. And I think the big thing here is it's not willpower. Yes, willpower is probably part of it, but that's not the big thing that's going to drive that, right? So because I just think a lot, like, people see people on the internet, or they just are like, hey, I want to lean out. And so that's their goal, right? They just want to do it. They just want to get as lean as possible. And there's some things that are going to go into that your body may fight back. And again, where you can also maintain, I think, is also super important, because a lot of people think that they can stay super shredded, right? They get lean, they're just going to stay as lean as possible all the time. And again, that's just unfortunately not the case. Now, there are some people that can certainly do that. We'll talk about that today, but I want to go into those things. So again, how lean someone can comfortably get to and stay isn't just about willpower or want. Again, if that were the case, you'd probably see a lot more people doing that. If it was just one, you definitely would see way more people. And then if you also combine, hey, willpower, you also would likely see more. But that's not always the case, right? It's going to be the interaction between energy availability essentially being how many calories you're currently consuming, also based on your body mass and your activity levels. Best way that's the formal definition of it. And I put formal in quotations there. But to me, energy availability is, again, it is that interaction between, are you in a low energy state from a calorie standpoint, and again, how lean you are there. Stress load, right? So your stress load is going to be super important here. I've talked about the stress load bucket multiple times. Your recovery capacity, which goes into stress load a bit, right? The higher your recovery capacity is, the larger your bucket can be. Your physiology. So what is your unique physiology in terms of just your unique makeup? And the thing with physiology is it is also very adaptive, right? So things that you've done in the past are going to play a role in that. You could also throw in things like medications, again, things that you've just done in the past to your body are going to be important here, and it's going to impact that. And then again, genetics, just your unique genetic makeup, family history, right? These are all going to be things that will impact that. You could go as far back to just, again, because different ethnicities may do things like their bodies are slightly different, right? There. And then we have body comp history as well too. What have you done from a body composition standpoint? Have you yo-yo dieted in the past? Were you previously super muscular? Have you always been maybe less muscular, quote unquote skinny fat? All these things are going to impact that. And it's an interaction between those. It's not just one thing. It's the overall interaction. Each one's going to play into each other there. And then obviously there are likely there's some other things that will play a role too, but those are the main ones. And most people try to override that system and force a level of leanness their body doesn't support at that time. Hey, I see this person, I want to look like that person, I'm just going to get there. Hey, this person did a body show, I want to try and get as lean as them. Or hey, I saw this person, I want to look like them. I saw this athlete, that's exactly how I want to look. Or you just want to be leaner than what you are, and a lot of times people will try to override that system. I also think one thing too with this is this can change over time when we start to improve our overall inputs and habits. We'll talk about that, but I think where, as we'll go through this, come up, but just because you can't reach a level of leanness right now doesn't necessarily mean that's not going to be the case all the time. As you improve habits, body comp, etc., you likely are going to be able to push things a little bit further there. And so what we need to remember here, there are things in our control that make it easier to get and stay leaner for you. And as I was just saying, this range does change over time. So just because maybe getting to 25% body fat as a male is challenging, a little bit tougher to maintain, you'll likely be able to push that down over time. If you just force it and you keep just trying to force it and you keep working against your body, it is going to fight back and it's going to be really hard to maintain that. But no matter what, there are going to be levels of leanness that do become unsustainable and detrimental to health if you stay there too long. And I think our universal numbers that we could put on here would be sub 6 to 8-ish% for men, right? It's like no matter what you do, like that's just going to be how good your habits are. These things we're going to go over. It's like that's likely not going to be a spot where your body is going to feel good no matter what. And you're likely going to see some adaptations to that over time that aren't particularly positive adaptations. And then for women, you're looking at sub 16-ish%, right? And so I guess some of these adaptations that we would see would be things like lower libido for women, menstrual cycle dysregulation, infertility fertility issues for men, lower testosterone, women, hormonal imbalances, lower thyroid output, increased risk for bone health issues, right? Many different things that can happen. Those are some of the main ones on there. You're just not going to be in a good spot to build muscle. So again, no matter what, we are going to run into those issues. So this is where if you see somebody doing a bodybuilding competition, like that level of leanness they get to should not be something that they stick to at all times. It is a thing where you need to drive down to it, and then you probably need to get out of there. And then, as we'll talk about today, finding a level where you feel good at and where your body feels good at. So I think it's important to start with gender So it's important to go over gender first because men have lower levels of essential body fat needs. So we can dip into lower body fat percentages. We can maintain a leaner look overall. Women need to have higher levels of essential body fat. And it makes sense from obviously having a baby and then having to feed that baby, like that's a very energy costly process. And so it makes sense that women need to have more levels of essential body fat to be able to do that. Obviously, again, I always come back to this, in today's modern environment, this isn't a problem because it's easy. Like we don't have to, most people, obviously, if you're listening to this podcast, you probably don't have to worry about there being a shortage of food. You're going to be able to get your calories. But again, this was not something that our bodies evolved with, right? Like they evolved with potential food scarcity at times and pretty extreme. And so we have adaptations that allow us to be able to maintain that. And so the body is very protective of losing energy, right? And so in the sense, losing energy being, hey, it's not getting in enough energy, and then losing energy in terms of losing body fat. And then losing body fat itself can be a signal to your brain, and your brain's, okay, we're losing energy, what's going on here? But then what's really a strong driver is your body fat percentage. The leaner you get, that's where you start to run into issues, right? And so again, women are going to run into that at higher levels of body fat. They're going to start to run into issues again at much higher levels there. And so again, we're looking at, like I said, for men, that's under that. For some people, under 10%. And then for some people, you could slightly go under. For women, it could be under 20%. It could be slightly higher than that. But definitely, again, once you dip into those mid-teens and lower, that's where you're more than likely going to start to run into some issues. And you'll have some adaptations that are not going to be great long-term on there. So like I said, men tend to be able to hang out So we have lower levels of essential body fat, which we talked about. And this kind of goes into what I just said there, but we're also able to hang out at lower body fat levels relative to them with less detriment to things like sex hormones, biofeedback compared to women, right? So there is less friction getting to and staying in those lower body fat ranges compared to women. Again, there's probably less friction in terms of when you're actively dropping body fat so we need to look at absolute levels of how lean you get. Yes, we know that. But then also when we're actively dropping body fat, women, again, are going to have a larger, that signal alarm system is going to be louder to the brain for women than it is to men, because again, for all those reasons where it's like, all right, we're losing body fat, what's going on here? So again, there's going to be less friction on the way down to getting leaner into losing body fat, but also when we get to those essential levels of body fat, that's where, again, it's just less detrimental to men than women. In most cases, I never want to be like, hey, this is 100% the case for every single person, but for most people, you're into that. And so I think what that means for women is we're going to have to be careful with super aggressive diets. We definitely are going to want to take some diet breaks and refeeds, and we need to spend some time being well fueled versus just trying to undereat and then also exercise a ton, because exercise does play a role in that, right? We talked initially energy availability being a thing, and that does take into consideration your movement and your activity levels there. So gender is going to be the first one that's going to impact this there, right? So again, we can't compare the levels of body fat from between the sexes, and then again, even as we drop body fat, you're just going to have more noise on the way down from a female perspective in most situations, right? You take two people that have the same exact setup, protocols, methods, women are likely going to have a little bit more stress and a little bit more friction in that process. It doesn't mean that fat loss is different for women. It just means we have to be on top of these things a bit more. And like I said, this also isn't necessarily the case across the board either, right? There's going to be some individual differences here. Number two is just going to be genetics. Some people's bodies let them hang out leaner without / less downsides to biofeedback and things like thyroid and sex hormones. And this isn't just necessarily like good or bad genetics, right? So it's going to show up as some people are going to have much better appetite regulation on the way down and at lower levels of body fat. So again, we're talking on the way down in a energy deficit, getting to lower levels of body fat. But then once we get to these leaner levels of body fat, again, some people are just going to have less noise. And it could be a thing where maybe you have some noise on the way down, but then you have less noise when you kind of hang out there in your well field. But again, these numbers are going to change based on where exactly you fall on the body fat spread there. And so again, one person, could be at 8 effortlessly. And obviously there's going to be things that their habits and things we're going to continue to go over here that do matter and will impact this. But again, if everything's the same, you will have some people that can maintain a lower level body fat and have less downsides and less impact on their biofeedback, blood work, etc., than somebody else. But again, this is going to show up as appetite regulation. So again, somebody may be able to regulate their appetite much better when they get leaner, whereas other people just get ravenously hungry and it's really hard to moderate their food intake. Neat response. And so this is your non-exercise activity thermogenesis. And so some people will subconsciously move less in an energy deficit and when they get leaner. Again, that's their body's way of conserving energy. But other people may not have those adaptations on the way down. And so that's going to allow you to stay a bit leaner if you don't have those sort of adaptations. We could try and just keep movement up, but definitely a sign that your body is going to fight that. And that kind of subconscious movement, blinking, fidgeting, talking speed, etc., like those things do add up. And those are largely things that you really don't have a lot of control over either. This can show up as fat distribution, right? Where people lose body fat last or where their body prefers to store body fat is going to impact how lean you can look, right? At least in certain spots. Now, at the end of the day, you get lean, you're going to look lean. But again, some people, depending on how their body distributes body fat, like, you could have somebody that's, say you're at these more moderate body fat ranges, 15-ish%, slightly higher, between 15 and 20 for men, between 28 and 32% for women. Depending on how somebody stores body fat, like somebody can look a lot leaner at certain body fat levels compared to others, right? And then hormonal sensitivity. Again, some people are just going to have larger reductions, dysregulation when they start to get leaner, which in turn is going to impact things downstream, right? So like just take testosterone, for example. If a male does see their testosterone start to tank as they get leaner, and maybe for them, their body's, all right, we don't want to be under 10%. Then you really start to see testosterone, thyroid start to get impacted. Well, that's going to show up as lower energy, less motivation. You're just not going to feel as good. And so that's going to be hard to maintain that, right? And then same thing for women, right? Once you start to see things like estrogen, progesterone get out of whack or get dysregulated, even testosterone to an extent, like that's going to show up in your motivation, how hard you can push yourself, et cetera. And that's going to have downstream impacts on how you feel in the things that you do in that situation, right? So this is why two clients at the same body fat percentage, for one, it feels like they can maintain that effortlessly. They don't have to worry about anything. And then one, it just feels like they're white knuckling it the whole time. And so we have to pay attention to that, because if someone does feel like they have to white knuckle it all the time, it ultimately comes down to, okay, what are you in good health here, right? So let's say you get super lean and you want to maintain that leanness. Are you in good health here, looking at your blood markers? And then if you are white knuckling it, how is that showing up in your life? Is that worth it to you? If it is, and you're okay with the potential downsides of the biofeedback that you could have, maybe a little bit lower libido, et cetera, then you ultimately have that choice there. Again, I don't think that's a great place to live, but again, some people do want to do that. And you just really have to be on top of everything else that we're talking about here. And again, like I said, really paying attention to your biofeedback and then also potentially pairing it with, say, things like blood work and stuff like that. The good news is if you hang out at these lower body fat levels, for the most part, you're not really you shouldn't really run into metabolic health issues, like stuff like that. Some of these common type 2 diabetes, you're likely not going to run into those issues here at those. So you are going to protect yourself against some of these things, but there are still some downsides of living a little bit too lean that can show up in today's modern environment, right? Really, the thing is, you can't, a lot of times when people are trying to live a bit leaner than what they want, it's like they're upset that they want to maximize their thyroid, their testosterone's low, they want to do all these things. They're just trying to do too many things. And you just ultimately have to decide, what approach do I want to do? If you decide you want to do the TRT route because your testosterone's lower, the root cause could be, hey, you're just living too lean. and also your lifestyle, you're super active, do you want to pursue something like TRT, which isn't a cost-free thing as many people make it out to be? I think it's generally a good thing, and I definitely think people should and can consider it, but it's not necessarily cost-free, right? And the same thing with HRT. Probably mostly, I would say HRT is probably going to be more positive for women. There obviously still are some specific things that you need to look into, like the time that you start getting on HRT, the later into menopause that you do, you might be at slightly higher risk of certain things like cancer, et cetera. So you do need to weigh that, but none of this stuff is cost free, and you just need to double check on that, right? But for some people, they could hang out, let's say for men, 8 to 10%, women, 16, 18, 20%, and then they can maintain that effortlessly. Now, like I've said many times, I'm going to continue to say these other things that we do will also impact that as well too. So again, if you can maintain that effortlessly, then it's like, all right, you're good to go. And you pair it with your biofeedback, and we really do look into, all right, hey, like blood work, biofeedback's in a good spot, then it's like, all right, you're good to go. You don't necessarily need to, you can maintain a leaner look. But again, where this is going to fall for people is just going to be dependent on genetics for one, and then obviously everything else that we're going to talk about there. So the next thing is how much muscle you have. I do believe that muscle is going to allow you to hang out at slightly leaner levels for you. More muscle is going to give you a higher resting energy expenditure, slightly, not a ton, but it is going to help increase your total daily energy expenditure, better glucose disposal. So your body's just going to utilize the food you give it much better. And then I do think it gives you a little bit of a buffer for food intake. Again, this isn't going to be a drastic thing where you can all of a sudden just stay super, super lean now because you have more muscle. But I do think it does give you a couple percentage points to where you could hang out a little bit leaner than you otherwise could if you didn't have as much muscle, right? And you're probably going to look leaner at any given body weight as well too, right? So it's multiple things that you're going to hit at with this. I do think it's a worthwhile pursuit to have some muscle. Now, you don't have to look like a massive muscle head. And I also think that building too much muscle overall, like if we're not also focused on cardiovascular fitness and improving that. And once you start to combine those things, it can get very hard to get very jacked without things like special sports supplements or TRT, having some aids to help you, right? Or unless you're just like absolutely crushing the recovery side of things, which is very hard for most people that are over 30, right? So again, more muscle is going to, in my opinion, going to help you sustain a little bit of a leaner look. Like I said, no matter what, once we get to these really low levels, that's where I think it can be more challenging. But when these more moderate body fat percentages, people that maybe have lost a lot of weight in the past and they've been at higher body fats and they've come down, I think if you build more muscle in that and you build some muscle in that process, you're going to be able to hang out a little bit lower than you otherwise could if you didn't focus on the muscle building side as well too. So the next one's going to be activity levels, right? So people who are more active are likely to hang out at leaner levels than somebody who is less active. And this makes sense, right? It's going to increase your total energy flux. You're just going to expend more energy. It can improve your metabolic flexibility. So again, how your body utilizes fat as fuel, carbohydrates as fuel, being able to use both of those, being able to switch between those two is very helpful in keeping you at a leaner look. And it allows for a higher caloric intake at a given body weight. So if the more active we are, because it increases total energy flux and we get energy moving through the system, we're expending more energy, we're going to be able to have a higher caloric intake, which is going to be helpful for you to maintain lower body fat levels and lower weights or any body weight in general, right? Whereas if you're not moving as much, your caloric intake will likely have to be a little bit lower than it could be, which is in today's modern environment going to make it tough to stay a bit leaner, right? So activity levels are super important here. Now, it is important though to consistently low fuel, low recovery plus too low of body fat can make this tougher. If we're trying to also exercise a ton while staying super lean and we're trying to fight that process, that can make it challenging, right? And this is where some people get themselves stuck, where they're trying to maintain like a super low body weight. They don't want to see it come up at all. So then they exercise a ton. Anytime they see it come up a pound, they're like, I got to exercise more. They eat less. And then they kind of get themselves stuck, and they get themselves stuck here at what I call artificially low maintenance calories. So we can't get ourselves stuck here. We just have to be careful we need to fuel properly. We need to match that output. And again, for also low recovery. And then we're also still trying to maintain too low of body fat levels for where we can sustain. You are going to run into some issues there. But activity levels are huge to help keep you staying leaner. Anytime that you look at diets, long-term diets, do they work? Long-term diet maintenance. The people that maintain higher levels of activity are always the ones that are able to maintain that weight loss there. Whereas the people that don't, they exercise a ton in the weight loss process and then they go away from that habit, they tend to gain the weight back. And that makes sense, right? Because that is a key piece of this. So the next thing that's going to allow you to be able to stay leaner or to maintain a certain level of leanness is going to be proper fueling and nutrition skills. The better your nutrition skills are, the more often you fuel properly, the easier it can be to hang out at leaner levels. The people who struggle to stay leaner usually have poor nutrition skills, and or don't ever properly fuel, right? So they try to skip meals, try to eat as low calories as possible all the time, have super low calorie days, saving calories for later in the day, or they try to fat loss diet 24/7, right? So in a weird way, taking time away from fat loss dieting actually helps here, right? Because your body's going to fight that less if you also fuel it. Now, in saying that, you still can fuel enough, get to maintenance, and you may still have to bring your body weight up a little bit if we're hanging out at levels that are too low for where our body feels comfortable at. Again, these habits though can allow you to dig a bit deeper and stay a bit deeper if you get these in check, right? If you're properly fueling throughout the day, you're less likely to get ravenously hungry, right? Which in turn is now you're less likely to overconsume calories where you may do that unintentionally. By fueling properly around your workouts, you're able to get more out of your workouts. You're able to have better adaptations in your workout sessions. Performance is better, right? You're able to just, you have the energy to do things, and that in turn obviously is going to expend more energy. So again, making sure that we're also fueling properly and we have good nutrition skills in terms of meal timing. We're not just skipping meals. We're not, like I said, eating as low calories as possible, always trying to choose the lower calorie option for everything. Having these days where maybe we overeat and then we try to undereat, or we just have days where we skip meals, right? We eat super low calorie days, or you're trying to just save calories for later in the day. Hey, I get nervous that I'm not going to have calories later. I'm going to get hungry and then I'm going to overeat. So then you do that, and now you haven't eaten all day, and then yes, you are more likely to overeat now because you were trying to save calories, right? And if you're just trying to fat loss diet 24/7, that is you're not properly fueling, and those are not good nutrition skills at that point. And taking some time away to fuel properly is going to allow you to stay leaner in the long term versus trying to white knuckle it essentially, right? And again, trying to white knuckle too low of body fat for you. A balanced diet. So again, it's not just calories. Calories do matter, but having a balanced diet of macros and micros is going to allow someone to hang out at leaner levels, right? So again, some examples of this would be, hey, we're eating enough protein, sufficient carbs for performance, because that is a big thing. Hey, somebody maybe eats high protein, but then they're trying to stay lean, or they want to keep losing more weight. So they keep carbs super low because they think that if they have carbs, their weight goes up, which it probably does a little bit, but they equate that with fat gain. So then they stay away from carbohydrates, right? Maybe fats, we still want to have enough fats, right? We don't want to just crash fats, say 20 grams, 10 grams a day for extended periods of time, right? So making sure you get enough fat, which usually I think in that 30 to 50 gram range per day is good for most people. And then again, micronutrient intake. I like to use Chronometer for this to see, is somebody getting a well-balanced diet, right? Are we just making sure we're not super low in one thing there? So again, making sure your micro intake is also in check, right? Because again, these extremes are going to reduce your ability to sustain a leaner look. Again, your body is likely going to fight that. If you're micro deficient in a lot of different things, you may not, like, your total daily energy expenditure may be slightly lower, which is going to be harder to maintain a leaner look, right? You're likely going to gain some weight there. If we're not getting enough carbs for performance, now we're not able to put in as much energy towards our training, right? And then if we don't get enough protein, you may not get those satiating effects of protein. And maybe from a body comp perspective, you're not able to build as much muscle. This comes back to nutrition skills, but having a well-balanced diet is going to allow you to stay leaner. So this next one kind of goes hand in hand with things that we've been talking about the whole time, but finding the spot where your body feels good. Again, some people force too lean of levels 24/7, which in turn makes it tougher to maintain leanness, as the body will typically fight back. So if you're trying to hang out too low, your body is going to push back to that, right? And this kind of comes back to, are you trying to white knuckle it? Again, there could be some appetite dysregulation. Again, some of those downstream impacts that we talked about from, say, things like thyroid output that could lower your total daily energy expenditure slightly. Again, lower testosterone, all those things that we talked about earlier, like, your body is likely going to fight back a bit with that. And so again, if you're trying to maintain too lean of look all the time, it's going to be harder to maintain that. And so we need to listen to our body here and find a comfortable range where you're fueling enough, it's close to your estimated maintenance calories, it's enough, right? If you're trying to maintain a look on, say, 1,700 calories, really across the board, you're likely too low. Now, there's going to be some exceptions to that, but I would like to get most people over a range where they can be above 2,000 calories as what they can eat most of the year, right? If we're under that, like, there's probably either some tracking issues, or we have some work to do, right? And or you're just trying to maintain too low of a body weight for where you're at right now, right? So again, sometimes the level your body feels best at is slightly higher than you want aesthetically. And so, but we can push lower for shorter periods of time. We just are not going to be able to hang out there. And again, go figure that out. I've dealt with this many times where they've gotten lean and then they want to maintain that, but it's very hard for them to do that. And they also have a high output. And so it's like, we unfortunately have to let our weight come up a little bit here. We have to let our body fat levels come up a little bit. This doesn't mean you're going to balloon up and gain a ton of body fat, but you do need to let it come up a little bit higher. And again, we could look at this from a body weight perspective and a body fat percentage perspective. Definitely body weight, you're probably going to see it come up a little bit after you get to your absolute lowest level. And that's okay. If you're fighting that, you're going to run into all these issues that I talked about. So again, we need to find the spot where our body feels good. And this is going to change over time based on where you're at and where you're coming from. Because again, if you're starting from say 40% body fat as a male, you may run into like getting to 25% and staying there. Or again, whether that's 30 pounds, 40 pounds, like getting to your lowest weight and then your lowest body fat like that, you may have to come up a little bit. Now, this doesn't mean you need to gain 50 pounds. It just means, hey, you might have to see it come up 5 to 10 pounds, and you might have to put on 1 to 3% body fat for you to sustain your body to feel good. And then you can push through and then you can lower this over time. But if we fight, that's where people run into issues, right? This is where if people fight this, maybe they're not super lean, right? You're not super lean, but you've lost a good amount of body fat. People try to keep forcing that. They haven't, their skills, their body comp, their habits, et cetera, haven't matched with where they're at now. And so there's always going to be that sort of pull to get back there, right? And so in this situation, just keep trying to force that lower or maintain. You're just going to need things to come up for a little bit and let your physiology get into a spot where it's like, all right, we feel comfortable here. And then you can keep pushing down. So again, this is where you're coming from is going to be super important because again, this could show up for somebody at say 25% body fat. This could show up at 15. This could show up at 10. And then again, there's obviously universal where, hey, once you get under that, it's likely going to show up in some form or fashion. And we just can't do that. Again, we need to find that sweet spot where we feel good. And I think this is that combination of, hey, maybe you don't have your absolute shreddest, leanest look, but hey, you're still in a good spot. Obviously, you're lifting weights during this time. You're still staying active. We're working on nutrition skills. Those are all going to be things that are going to offset fat gain, right? I think a lot of people think that it's like, we just think too black and white with things, right? Hey, my weight was here before. If I go back, that's exactly what I'm going to look like. Whereas, hey, if you've also changed your habits over time, you're in a completely different spot and it's going to be harder to get to those points because you've improved your habits. But again, where are we going to feel good? Hey, it's what I was talking about from an aesthetic standpoint. Again, maybe not your leanest, but hey, you still feel relatively good. Again, biofeedback's in a good spot. Digestion's good. Libido's in a good spot. Just feel like from a mood and energy level, you're at what I would say is 6 to 7 or higher out of 10 most of the time, or close to that 6 to 7. It's not realistic to expect to have 10 energy, 10 mood all the time. You're going to probably be closer to that 6 to 7 standpoint. Again, and the blood work's headed in the right direction there. Now, obviously, if you're still at these higher levels of body fat, you may still need to work on getting things lower, and that can mask it a little bit. But again, if we feel like we're really having to white knuckle losing 1 pound and it's just not happening, again, probably a sign that we need to take a break from trying to push weight down and we need to stabilize with where we're currently at on there. And again, remember, you can push leaner levels for a shorter period of time. If you want to get super shredded and you want to be 5% body fat, and again, people do this in bodybuilding competitions, there's nothing wrong with that. You can do it. It's just, you can't expect to stay there. Like, you're going to have to come back up most likely in 99.99% of the cases out there. So the next thing we need to consider is we need to have total stress load managed, and we need to have ability to manage stress. So the higher your overall stress load, the harder it is to recover. Your body's going to push back on getting leaner, right? It's going to be tougher to regulate your appetite, and it's going to be harder to add and maintain muscle when our stress bucket is constantly overflowing, right? So we need to look at our overall stress load here, because if that is not in check, it's going to be harder to stay leaner. Ask anybody who's been under a lot of stress, like that's obviously one piece of that goes into the stress bucket. But if you ask anyone, it's definitely harder to maintain a leaner look during that period of time. It's harder to get to that point either, right? And so again, this is going to include things like life stress, your training stress, gut stress, dieting stress, sleep and circadian rhythm stress. Those all fall into it, right? Again, you can't just separate those things. If you have a high training stress where you like to train a lot, you train super intense, and then you're also got a lot of work stuff going on, life stuff going on, and you're trying to maintain a calorie deficit, it's going to be harder to maintain where you're currently at and keep losing, right? Like, you have to manage those things there. And again, just as important is your ability to manage stressors. So not only is it, hey, we need to make sure we're not doing too much and things aren't overflowing, but we also need to manage the stressors that we do have currently, because if we don't, again, things are going to overflow, and that's where it's just going to be harder to stay leaner and to maintain your current level of leanness, and your body's likely going to want to creep up on there. And again, this could just be a lot of times when stress load's high, we're more reactive, willpower is lower, whatever it is. It could be a direct thing, but it could also be an indirect thing that just makes it more likely that it's just going to be hard to moderate your caloric intake. You're more likely to go over, et cetera, with that. So next one's going to be your sleep and circadian habits, right? If this is off, everything else is going to be harder. One, it's going to be harder to get leaner, and it's going to be harder to stay leaner, right? So again, this is going to impact hunger regulation. So there's going to be some appetite dysregulation for sure. Energy levels, right? So if energy levels are impacted because we have sleep, circadian rhythm habits that are not great, you're just not going to be you're not going to want to push yourself as hard. You're not going to want to be as active, right? It's going to impact your motivation and willpower. So you're less likely to make the choices that you need to make. So again, I think stress load management and circadian rhythm habits are super important here and overlooked there. It's obviously going to impact your recovery. You're not going to be able to bounce back. When recovery is low, we feel that, right? Energy is lower, willpower is lower. So a lot of these things end up at the same spot of there's some appetite dysregulation, willpower is lower, motivation's lower, which is you're less likely to make the choices that you need to make. And then training performance is impacted too if our sleep and circadian rhythm are off, which means that it's going to be harder to build muscle. You're not going to be able to get the best adaptations from your training as you would like if we were getting our sleep and circadian rhythms in check. So again, this is going to impact your ability to get leaner, but then also to maintain leaner levels. You're going to find that if either stress load is super high or again, your sleep or circadian rhythm is off, what's going to happen is the point to where your body's going to start to really fight back at lower levels of body fat is going to raise up a bit there, right? And again, genetics do play a role in this. Some people are able to get away with that. So we have to take that into consideration. As always, take the individual, but generally speaking, it's going to be harder to maintain leaner levels of body fat with these being off. And again, it's also going to hurt your ability to that process on the way down to getting leaner as well too. So another one that we need to consider is body fat history. So someone who's been at higher levels of body fat is most likely going to have a tougher time getting to and staying leaner than someone who has never been at higher body fat percentages. So you take someone that came from 30% body fat down to 15, they're likely going to have a tougher time sitting around 15% body fat. They're probably going to have to white knuckle it a bit more than someone who has always been 15% and has never really gone over that. That's just the unfortunate truth, right? Anyone that's lost a lot of weight, it's just harder to maintain leaner levels. Again, it can be done. We can dial in all these things, but it's not going to be hey, I was at 40% body fat. Now I'm just going to get down to 10% and then I'm just going to maintain that. It's likely going to be a journey from 40 down to 30, maintain for a little bit, 30 down to 23, maintain for a little bit, continue to dial in your habits, keep doing all the things you've been doing the entire time. Again, maybe we're going to be eating a little bit more during certain periods when we're stabilizing. 23 down to 6 to 17%. These are obviously super specific numbers, but I'm just kind of trying to paint a picture here. You stay around there, maybe it slightly goes up. And then now that's just going to be it's just going to be a long process to get there. It's not just going to be hey, 6 months, you're going to be there and everything's just going to be dandy. It's just going to take time. That's the unfortunate truth if body fat percentage is higher there. And again, these numbers add 5 to 10% to these for women as well too, right? Because it's really the same thing, except like I've been saying, like I said initially, it's also women are going to have a little bit of a higher stress response to getting leaner and lower levels of body fat. So just kind of make that even worse for women specifically, right? So again, body fat history is going to be huge. And this is why it's important to get an idea of where you've been, because that's going to impact things there. So those are the main things that are going to impact it, right? So again, to sum this up, remember the whole kind of thing of this is going to be, all right, this is going to be getting leaner, but then also getting lean. And getting lean and getting leaner is going to be relative to you. Yes, there are going to be general, hey, once you get for men under 10 to 15%, you're going to be pretty shredded, right? But we have to take it relative to you specifically. And for women, again, you're looking at, hey, sub 20, 25%. Again, you're going to be lean no matter what, but it's all relative to you and where you've been, because these numbers are, like I said, all relative to you and they move across time based on all these things there. But again, the things that are going to impact it are going to be gender. Men will have less friction getting in the process of getting leaner, but then also getting to lean levels. Women need to have about 5 to 10% more essential levels of body fat compared to men. Genetics are going to matter, right? Some people just have more, their body just fights back harder on the way down, but then also getting to leaner levels there. So again, genetics are going to play a role here. How much muscle you have is not going to have a massive role, but I do think it helps a couple percentage points down in terms of how lean you could stay with more muscle, right? Activity levels are going to be huge. The more active we are, we're likely going to be able to maintain leaner levels overall, and we're going to have a little less friction getting leaner in that process. However, we can't just underfuel in that process. Proper fueling and nutrition skills. We can't always just be trying a fat loss diet. We can't be skipping meals. We need to have good nutrition skills, and we need to have a period of time where we're properly fueling for us to continue to get leaner and to stay leaner as well too. And we also need to have that balanced diet with macros and micros accounted for. And we also need to find that sweet spot where your body feels good. If you're always trying to push past where your body feels good, you look over your habits, see if there's anything you can dial in from these things that we talked about here. Sometimes you need to live a little bit higher in terms of body fat percentage or weight than you maybe want, but we can push leaner levels for shorter periods of time. We just can't stay there all the time, because again, if we're trying to maintain that lower level than what our body wants, in a weird way, it's going to be harder to maintain that lower level. We need to also make sure our total stress load is managed, and we need to have the ability to manage our current stressors as well too. If we don't do that, it's going to be harder to, one, get leaner, but then also stay leaner. And then our sleep and circadian rhythm habits are also super important. Same thing, it's going to be harder to get down, but it's also going to be harder to maintain that if we're not getting good sleep. It's not a sure, like a, hey, for sure you're not going to be able to stay lean. Again, there's going to be people that genetically can do it, but it's definitely going to add more friction to the process. And then we need to look at body fat history. Where are you coming from? Because where you're coming from is going to be huge in terms of, generally speaking, like where you're coming from, the higher you are, it's going to be harder to maintain lower. But then we also need to look at recency of that. How recent were you at those higher levels? Because the more recent you were, it's definitely going to be harder to get leaner and leaner and to stay lower. You have to stabilize on the way down there. And to bring this back to exact numbers. So this is where all these things come into play. But most people should be able to get to 15 to 20% for men and 25 to 30% for women with good habits in place and time. I think if we improve our habits, we work on these things that I talked about in here, good nutrition habits, sleep and circadian rhythm habits, managing stress load, building some muscle, keeping activity levels high, like people will naturally gravitate towards this to those numbers, right? But going lower than those numbers, that's where it does start to come down to how well you execute everything else in this post and how much it's worth it to you. I guess what I mean by that is getting sub 25% for women, sub 15% for men, it is going to require some intentional effort, and you do need to execute things. You can't just, again, white knuckle your way there. And you do have to just weigh out how worth it is it for me to continue to push down, right? Because you need to weigh that out. For some people, it's not worth it, and that's okay. I think if you can get to these around 15 to 20% for men, around 25 to 30% for women, maybe slightly higher in women, you're likely going to be in a good spot from an overall health perspective. Obviously, we need to look at biofeedback, and we can also look at blood work as well to confirm that's the case. You also don't have to get super shredded either if you don't want to there. So I hope this gave you some insight into, okay, if I do want to get leaner, maybe this is what's holding me back. And then maybe also I'm just trying to maintain too low or too lean of body weight, body fat percentage for where I'm currently at right now. But I maybe need to stop trying to fight that because it's actually making it harder for me. So there's a lot of different ways that you could take this. But again, these are going to be the biggest things that will impact how lean you can get and how long you can stay in that leanness there. So hope this was helpful. Again, just as a reminder, I have my body recomp workshop. It will be on Thursday, July 9th at 1 p.m. Central. That's the evening for my people over in Europe area, I guess overseas, whatever that, yeah. And again, the link to that is in the show notes. But if you have questions on it, you can reach out to me on Instagram, Jeff, HOEHN_. So that's it for this episode. I hope you guys found this helpful. I'll talk to you soon.